Welcome back to the Synthesis of Yoga, the book that changed my life. We are now in the 7th chapter of part 1 of the Synthesis of Yoga. For those who are new, we are reading Sri Aurobindo's The Synthesis of Yoga, which is a distillation of yogic traditions of India and synthesized understanding of yoga that is presented as integral yoga. That's the grand synthesis. A process of yoga that is evolutionary, a process of yoga that is integral, that embraces life, not rejecting life. And this is the major book that gives the detailed understanding of this yogic system. And we are now reading this 7th chapter called Standards of Conduct and Spiritual Freedom. And in the last episode, which was 95, Sri Aurobindo gave us insights into the mental and moral ideals, the way it emerges in the society where human beings in society is transitioning from purely that instinct-driven existence to conscious mental life, cultivating mental, aesthetic, intellectual culture. In that transition emerges the laws of social conduct, codes of conduct based on mental principles. They, in their ideal extreme, expect the individual and collectivity to override the instinctive nature and bring in the light of reason. And they set high ideals. However, this doesn't really succeed in the society, even when an individual is able to bring out inspiring visions and ideals, because the individual and collective is still largely bound by the instinctive nature. Realization of such an ideal remains only as a potentiality, and that's where we have left our last episode. Now we will continue what we do with this gap between ideal and the instinctive drive of people and collectivity. We will be starting from paragraph 20. You will find the link in the description. Kindly look at the text so that we can read together and internalize Sri Aurobindo's consciousness by reading. And the act of very reading connects us with him. No individual rises to these heights except in intense moments. No society yet created satisfies this ideal. That is, individuals and collectivities conceiving wonderful ideals of justice, love, equality. It's wonderful to conceive them. In intense moments, you are deeply moved by these things, yet both individuals and collectivity are not yet able to satisfy the ideal. No individual rises to these heights except in intense moments. No society yet created satisfies this ideal. And in the present state of morality and human development, none perhaps can or to satisfy it. So there is an evolutionary journey of the individual and collective life happening, and different human groupings are at different stages of growth. And in the present state of morality and human development, in general human development across the world, none perhaps can or ought to satisfy it. It's not possible from the current stage of development to satisfy the high ethical ideals the mind is capable of conceiving. nature will not allow it. Nature knows that it should not be. Wow, that is quite a radical statement from Sri Aurobindo. Nature will not allow it. Nature knows that it should not be. Why it should not be? That's quite a powerful statement here. A shocking statement. Nature knows that it should not be. Let's find out the reasons. The first reason is that our moral ideals are themselves, for the most part, ill-evolved, ignorant, and arbitrary. Mental constructions rather than transcriptions of the eternal truths of the Spirit. So, here is the very first reason why nature will not allow. Nature knows that we should not be. The reason is the way we are conceiving the moral ideals. These are very ill-evolved, ignorant, and arbitrary. Mental constructions rather than transcriptions of the eternal truths of the Spirit. There is a truth of the Spirit that is eternal. That can be transcribed into mental terms, moral terms, but that is not usually the case. What we get as mental ideals are ill-evolved, ignorant, and arbitrary constructs, not truly a transcription of the Spirit's truths. Because it is not the transcription of the Spirit's truth, and it is only a mental construct, arbitrary, ignorant, and ill-evolved. It's not yet emerged in its purity, in its light, in its strength. Because of that, it cannot succeed. So the first reason is that our moral ideals are themselves, for the most part, ill-evolved, ignorant, and arbitrary. Mental constructions rather than the transcriptions of the eternal truth of the Spirit. So when our constructs are very limited, then nature will not allow it to continue. Authoritative and dogmatic. They assert certain absolute standards in theory. Absolute standards in theory. Authoritative, dogmatic. These are typical tendencies of harshness of human mind that defines its rules, codes of conduct, and fixes it. And then, in order to impose it, it becomes authoritative. And its unwillingness to change makes it dogmatic. They assert certain absolute standards in theory. But in practice, every existing system of ethics proves either in application, unworkable, or in fact, a constant coming short of the absolute standard to which the ideal pretends. So there is this high ideal standard set by the society. What should be your appropriate code of conduct based on mental constructions, mental understanding, which is necessarily limited. So when such standards are set in theory, in practice, every existing system of ethics proves either in application unworkable. It's not practical. And we can see this constantly in our society, people saying, all wonderful, ideas are all great, but it is not practical. It has to be practical, doable, applicable in society. Either in application unworkable, or in fact a constant coming short of the absolute standard. So even if it is applied, there is always a shortcoming. It doesn't reach the perfection it seeks, to which the ideal pretends. So authoritative and dogmatic, they assert certain absolute standards in theory, but in practice every existing system of ethics proves either in application unworkable or is in fact a constant coming short of the absolute standard to which the ideal pretends. So when it comes to spiritual life, we create our own mental standards. You should not have attachment. You should be free from all attachments. It's wonderful. You understand the theoretical part, philosophical part, the reason for equality, equanimity, non-attachments. Everything is wonderful. But the human nature doesn't easily let go of its attachments. Our instincts doesn't let go of its attachments. So even when you start creating such references as an absolute standard, and people try to create also artificial rules. To give you an example from Aurobindo, the idea of non-attachment. So experimenting on one thing is voluntary experiment, that you don't stay in the same house for long, you keep moving. That's voluntary choice. But when this idea of non-attachment is converted into social institutional rule, when it is imposed, like you had been managing this place for some time, now you get out, don't be attached, forcing an individual out in the name of being non-attached. That's how the wonderful ideals get corrupted and made into standardized mental constructs. And it has nothing to do with the spirit of detached, non-attachment, the inner freedom with which one can engage with life, its relationships, its context. So authoritative and dogmatic, they assert certain absolute standards in theory, but in practice every existing system of ethics proves either in application unworkable or is in fact a constant coming short of the absolute standard to which the ideal pretends. So how to manage your assets and resources with a complete detachment? Wonderful ideal, but in practice it doesn't happen. And this is a struggle between the mental transcript of a wonderful ideal, or mental notions and constructs, and the actual human nature. If our ethical system is a compromise or a makeshift, it gives at once a principle of justification to the further sterilizing compromises which society and the individual hasten to make with it. So if our ethical system is a compromise or a makeshift, a small, temporary, compromised construct, it gives at once a principle of justification. So it leaves the door open for justifying whatever stuff you want to do. To the further sterilizing compromises, sterilizing, that means it really takes away the essential spirit of things, which society and the individual hasten to make with it. So we do create all these rules and regulations continuously in order to arrive at an ideal society. And I see constantly this happening in Aurobindo. And all kinds of rules and regulations are created so that people idea is how to go beyond ego, how to go beyond attachment, how to become generous in terms of how to become collaborative. Wonderful ideas, but these things doesn't happen by creating rules and regulations, and often these are compromises and makeshift items, and that gives at once principle of justification to the further sterilizing compromises which society and the individual hasten to make with it. So we create compromises and makeshift arrangements in order to manage many of these things. And society, individuals use them to work around all that continuously happen. And if it insists on absolute love, justice, and justice right with an uncompromising insistence, it soars above the head of human possibility and is professed with lip homage but ignored in practice. So, on one hand, when we push it to the extreme of absolute love, justice, and right with an uncompromising insistence, then it go way beyond the human head, above the head of human possibility, and is professed with lip homage but ignored in practice. Whether it is non-violence, ahimsa, truthfulness, justice, we can see all the politicians providing their lip service, empowering the people, empowering the masses, all kinds of stuff being promoted or propagated in the name of absolute rules, absolute ideals. Not practically done, but only lip service is done. This is what we are standing up for. We are standing up for human unity. We are standing up for collaboration. We are standing up for freedom of the individual. There is lip service, love thy neighbor, everything. Nobody disagrees with wonderful principles, and everyone would go on doing the lip service of these are our great ideals. But in practice, simply doesn't happen. So, if it insists on absolute love, justice, right with an uncompromising insistence, it soars above the head of human possibility and is professed with lip homage but ignored in practice. Even it is found that it ignores other elements in humanity which equally insist on survival but refuse to come within the moral formula. So, there are other aspects of us. So it is found that it ignores the other elements in humanity which equally insist on survival. Our instinctive nature in humanity, there is a need of survival, and all that is related to surviving and persisting, and therefore they refuse to come within the moral formula. Because these deeper instinctual drives are there. When an ideal ignores it and tries to force fit it, then they insist on survival, which ignores the other elements in humanity which equally insist on survival but refuse to come within the moral formula. So no matter how much the mental ideals try to force fit the humanity into these frameworks, ignoring other dimensions of its survival, persistence, all that, then those parts completely refuse to participate, refuse and deny the moral formula. For just as the individual law of desire contains within it invaluable elements of the infinite whole which have to be protected against the tyranny of the absorbing social idea, the innate impulse too, both of the individual and of the collective man, contain in them invaluable elements which escape the limits of any ethical formula, yet discovered and are yet necessary to the fullness of harmony of an eventual divine perfection. So there are invaluable elements within the individual and individual's drive for individualization, individual freedom. Same way, there is something in the collective man, that is invaluable element which cannot be rejected, that our ethical formulas fail to grasp. So which escape the limits of any ethical formula, yet discovered and are yet necessary to the fullness and harmony of an eventual divine perfection. So if we are to arrive at an eventual divine perfection, the essential truths of individual liberty and the collective harmony, wholeness, they need to come together. But that complexity, our moral ideals and mental constructs cannot really grasp and give form to. So which escape the limits of any ethical formula yet discovered and are yet necessary to the fullness of harmony of an eventual divine perfection. Let's read that once again. For just as the individual law of desire contains within it invaluable elements of the infinite whole, that what individual represents and the force that is animating the individual to seek, it carries invaluable elements that is necessary for the infinite whole, which have to be protected against the tyranny of the absorbing social idea. In the same way, the innate impulse too, both of individual and of collective man, contain in them invaluable elements which escape the limits of any ethical formula yet discovered and are yet necessary to the fullness and harmony of an individual and divine perfection. Moreover, absolute love, absolute justice, absolute right reason, in their present application by the bewildered and imperfect humanity, come easily to be conflicting principles. So in the current imperfect humanity, even if we try to apply absolute love, absolute justice, absolute right reason, these values themselves come in conflict. Dharma Sankata. So, absolute love, absolute justice, absolute right reason in their present application by a bewildered and imperfect humanity. Because we are bewildered and imperfect, therefore they come easily to be conflicting principles. So the ethical ideals, when it is attempted to be applied in society by the imperfect human nature, they show their internal conflict between them. Justice often demands what love abhors. When it is human love, when it comes to our loved ones, we are very easily willing to let go of the justice dimension because this one is very dear to me. Someone who is my friend, someone who is very dear to me, someone made a mistake. But someone else who suffered is a stranger, nothing to do with you. And you would still go supporting the one who loves someone whom you are close and dear. But if you look impartially from the point of view of justice, then your personal attachments and relationships not come into picture. But a human being is torn between his affinities, attachments, preferences, which all package itself in the form of love. Love means I will care for you, I will support you no matter what. Then if the person go and do something that is inappropriate, we still go on supporting. So justice and love can very easily come in conflict. It's not easy to be impartial and to provide justice in a context where you have close connections. So love and justice often find themselves to be in conflict. Justice often demands what love abhors. Right reason, dispassionately considering the facts of nature and human relations in search of a satisfying norm or rule, is unable to admit without modification either any reign of absolute justice or any reign of absolute love. So the right reason, dispassionately considering both justice and love, facts of nature and human relationships in search of satisfying norm or rule is unable to admit without modification. It has to modify to fit into the society's current stage of development. So either any reign of absolute justice or any reign of absolute love as it is will not be possible. So reason will compromise, will create and adopt, modify it in order to fit into the society and its requirements. And the way the network of people works, affinities work, there is always this conflict. So right reason dispassionately considering the facts of nature and human relations in search of a satisfying norm or rule is unable to admit without modification either any reign of absolute justice or any reign of absolute love. And in fact, man's absolute justice easily turns out to be, in practice, a sovereign injustice. So, in practice, it becomes exactly opposite. Take, for example, our system of justice in India. Court cases can drag on and on for decades. Practically, when something justice is denied for decades, it is the worst injustice you can have in a society. And that's one of the greatest failure of our legal system, because it allows, in the name of justice, this endless prolongation, which in practice become injustice. So, and in fact, man's absolute justice easily turns out to be in practice a sovereign injustice. For his mind, one-sided and rigid in its constructions, puts forward a one-sided, partial and rigorous scheme or figure and claims for it totality and absoluteness and an application that ignores the subtler truths of things and the plasticity of life. Every situation is unique and life is very, very, very plastic. There is a higher degree of complexity that our mind cannot grasp. And the tendency of the mind is to wipe out all the nuances and standardize rules, regulations. And it always confronts exception to the rule. Because life is infinitely flexible and every context is nuanced, but it cannot handle that nuances. Therefore, it will choose some standardized truth, standardized rules, regulations, and in the process, it is delivering compromised justice or plain injustice. And in fact, man's absolute justice easily turns out to be, in practice, sovereign injustice. For his mind, one-sided and rigid in its constructions. This is one of the problems with the mind. It has a limited experience, a limited knowledge. It is one-sided and rigid in its constructions. Once it forms, once human mind gets hardened and formed, it becomes very, very rigid in its constructions. This mind puts forward a one-sided, partial and rigorous scheme or figure. So such a mind, rigid, one-sided, when it puts forward a rule, a scheme or a figure rigorously, it is bound to be within that rigidity and claims for it totality and absoluteness and an application that ignores the subtler truth of things and plasticity of life. So it ignores the plasticity, contextual nuances it cannot handle. And this is usually what happens in organizations. You design systems and processes so that things can be automated, things can be streamlined. But in reality, there are always endless variations and nuances. Then we try to fit all these nuances into standardized template, SOP, standard operating procedures, which ignores the fine variations, contextual requirements, and make it fixed and rigid. all our standards turned into action either waver on a flux of compromises or err by this partiality and unrealistic structure. This is the challenge every policymaker, every process designer, every rule maker has to deal with. All our standards turned into action either waver on a flux of compromises or err by its partiality and unrealistic structure. The complexity on the ground, the complexity of life is way too high for the human mind to grasp. So there is a tendency to simplify everything and put everything into a formula, an unrealistic structure, and try to fit life into it. Or constant compromise of the rules. It fluctuates between the two. Either a waver on a flux of compromises or err by this partiality and unrealistic structure. The moment there is a space for a rule to be made, exceptions to be made, and that is used by the human nature to create all kinds of waivers that favors its own whims and fancies. So all our standards turned into action either waver on a flux of compromises or err by this partiality and unrealistic structure. Humanity sways from one orientation to another. The race moves upon a zigzag path led by conflicting claims, and on the whole works out instinctively what nature intends, but with much waste and suffering, rather than either what it desires or what it holds to be right, or what the highest light from above demands from the embodied spirit. So this is what eventually happened. Humanity sways from one orientation to another, caught between mental rules and vital instincts. One orientation or other. The race moves upon a zigzag path led by conflicting claims, and on the whole works out instinctively what nature intends. So eventually what nature intends happens through human beings. Even when human being is imagining that I am the one who is creating these rules, regulations, moral constructs, everything, end of the day, he is still part of nature's works, but with much waste and suffering. So that's the difficulty. There is a great deal of suffering and waste that happens in the process of this zigzag movement, rather than either what it desires or what it holds to be right. So on one thing is what human nature desires, or the mind holds this is the right thing to do, or what the highest light from above demands from the embodied spirit. So these are the three standards. One is the instinctive vital nature, vital physical nature desires. Other is what mind considers to be right. Third is the highest light from above, the spiritual light from above demands from the embodied spirit. So these are the three steps of nature and threefold life that is constantly interacting with each other, and we are caught between all these three. So humanity sways from one orientation to another. The race, human race, moves upon a zigzag path led by conflicting claims, and on the whole works out instinctively what nature intends, but with much waste and suffering, rather than either what it desires or what it holds to be right, or what the highest from above demands from the embodied spirit. Cannot follow any of this. It moves from one orientation to other, and eventually what nature intends, it will work itself out, but with great deal of suffering and waste. That's how our mental attempts find itself caught between lower instincts on one side, the higher call on the other side. And it goes zigzag. It sinks downward, it gets inspired, ascend upward, falls back. So all that interactions, mixture constantly happen. And through all that, nature works out her goals through the human being. So with that, we come to the end of this episode. Thank you for being with me in this journey of diving into Sri Aurobindo's lines, wisdom, and internalizing it. I hope you're enjoying it. Please do share your experience, your observations, your insights. That will help everyone in this journey. Thank you and see you next week.